CJRed presents Accidental Proposal by CJRed. Chapter 29. Storm Before the Calm. If you had asked Draco a year ago if he would ever want to murder his mates, he would have told you no. They had survived a war together, after all. Nothing could separate them. But the third week he was unable to get Hermione alone because someone needed her to help them with revisions. He was ready to throttle them all, at the least. Then there were the exams themselves, which were approaching so fast it was startling. Hermione was a total mess, and he had taken to helping Ginny slip her calming draft in dreamless sleep. Pansy was doing the same to Theo, who was equally worried about exams and his sister's incredible ability to try and make 30 hours out of 24. In fact, the witch had spent an hour one morning at lunch crying over the fact that she didn't have a time turner, so that she could spend more time buried in her notes. That had been the first time Draco had slipped her a calming draft. In the end, Draco had never been more excited for exams to be finished than he was this year. Hermione and he were headed to an undisclosed location where he planned to lock her in a room and do nothing that required clothing for at least a month. Dreams of that were all that kept him going as he sat up staring at his exhausted sleeping fiancée most nights. He sighed as he thought about that as well. Hermione wasn't technically his fiancée anymore. The runes on their skin were a matrimony bond that had indeed been logged with the ministry. Thank Merlin that office had stayed in the ministry and not been moved to the prophet. Theo had paid a small fortune in bribes to keep it out of the paper as it was. The bond itself hadn't been logged in 4 decades and should have been a major story. Draco had been forced to send an owl to his parents, letting them know. His father had not been surprised, but rather inquired as to the date of the wedding. Draco hadn't sent a reply to that question because he hadn't been able to get one out of the witch in question. Hermione was so focused on her studies she refused to even entertain conversations that didn't include something relevant. Pansy had finally given up and told Draco to just tell his mother to start making plans. Draco had shrugged but had done no such thing. He knew better than to give his mother free rein over an event like his own wedding. Plus, despite her distraction now, he knew Hermione would want to have a say on the event. She probably already had lists compartmentalized somewhere in her incredibly beautiful mind. Their lovemaking had also changed a bit. It was much more frantic and desperate the last few weeks. Stolen moments, really. And to his amusement, she seemed to enjoy classrooms. He was more than happy to oblige. Those few hours of lovemaking were his sanity. Well, that and the fact that she spent every night in his bed, even if they were just sleeping. The original thought that they would feel pain if separated had proved true. They could last about 8 hours apart before the bond caused them discomfort. Draco had gone back to visit his father with Potter in order to secure a wand for the man to use from the French ministry. It had been gone for 3 days, and they had both been desperate by the end of the weekend. Harry Potter was another surprise to Draco. He had been sure the boy who lived would throw a complete fit at the idea of his Death Eater father teaching Hermione Granger charms. However, when Potter had been told, he had nodded, and then asked how Lucius Malfoy was going to teach her a bloody thing without a wand. He then had pointed out that the healer was a spy for Kingsley. Tracy, who would seem to have a soft spot for the idiot, had started working with him on a solution, and Draco had to give them credit. They had come up with a brilliant plan. Harry Potter had made a formal request of the minister that the Malfoy family be placed under the supervision of the French ministry, and seeing as how Hermione Granger was going to become a Malfoy, it had been hard for the man to refuse the offer. So with the French minister's personal backing, the Malfoy family had been handed over to another ministry to be monitored. Kingsley Shacklebolt had been kept happy by a large amount of gold the ministry got for keeping the whole matter private. The French ministry had been happy by the fact that they could lay claim, indirectly, for 1/3 of the Golden Trio. Hermione had reluctantly agreed to work with the French ministry to tighten their allegiance with the British. It was a win for everyone, and it still amused Draco that Harry Potter made such a damn good politician. All in all, it translated to his family no longer being under house arrest, and his father now being able to wield a wand and practice magic, without the threat of being tossed back in Azkaban. If Draco was slightly annoyed that his father had bought himself out of trouble again, he was careful not to show it. Everyone else around him was annoyed enough for him anyways. Ginny had left again when Harry had returned with Tracy by his side to inform them of the plan. Although she had not said a word, it was clear the red-headed witch was furious. Blaise had followed after her looking troubled, but throwing Draco and Hermione an apologetic look. Tensions had run high for a few days before the group had settled back down again. Another problem, however, was that while they could tell their friends that Lucius was going to teach Hermione charms under his alias, they could not reveal to anyone but Harry Potter that Severus Snape was alive and well. That was perhaps the hardest part for Hermione, he supposed, was having to lie to her brother any time the conversation turned to their apprenticeships. Draco hadn't understood why his godfather would allow Harry Potter to know that he was alive, until he had watched the reunion between the two. Whatever it was Potter had seen in Snape's memories had erased his animosity towards the wizard, and it would seem that almost dying had caused his godfather to do a complete 180 in regards to his feelings toward Potter. Hermione seemed to understand, but had told him it wasn't her story to tell, and he had left it alone. Someday he might ask Severus about it, but for now he was just grateful to have his godfather back. They'd flew over for dinner every Friday night now, and it was the only time Hermione stopped her revisions, although she would rush back and stay up late to make up for taking the time off, much to the displeasure of Bop, who had taken to haunting her mistress to force her to eat. Draco knew that as stressful as this time was, it was only temporary, so he just gritted his teeth when he wanted to snatch notes out of his love's hands and utilize every underhanded trick he could to make sure she didn't injure or starve herself. He was going to be very happy when this was all over, and he didn't have to slip her potions. Hermione watched Draco as he dressed and sighed. He had dark circles under his eyes again, and all she wanted to do was pull him back to bed, ravish him, and then let him take a nap. However, he was off to take his first NEWT, and she wanted to review her notes for the charms practical that they would both take this afternoon. So instead of pulling him back to bed, she handed him his dragonhide gloves and stood up to kiss him on the cheek. Draco being Draco, however, the kiss turned into a bit of a show, only broken up when Blaise started whistling at them, having come back for his gloves. Hermione pulled away, panting, and couldn't help laughing as the pleased smirk that spread across Draco's face. She hit him for good measure, and shoved him out the door to the greenhouses. She had the dormitory to herself, as all three of the Slytherin wizards were in exams. Pansy had dragged Theo out, for what she assumed would be some serious snogging in a classroom, 20 minutes before Hermione had snogged Draco for good luck. Ginny was sitting the exam with Blaise, as were Daphne and Tracy, so when there was a knock on the door, she knew it had to be Pansy. "Come in, Pans." The witch walked in and threw herself on Theo's bed, shaking her head at Hermione, surrounded by all of her notes. "It is charms, Hermione. You hold the highest grade in the class. Well, forever. Why are you not taking a nap?" Hermione grimaced and shuffled her notes. "Probably because no one has slipped me a potion today." Pansy sat up shocked and then chuckled. "Bloody hell, you know?" Hermione rolled her eyes. "Of course I know. Honestly, the fact that you lot think I wouldn't notice that I am under the influence of a calming draught, or that I can't taste the dreamless sleep in my tea is insulting." Pansy shrugged, looking totally unrepentant. "It's your own fault. You were worrying your brother and soulmate into an early grave." Hermione blew her hair out of her face, and she bent down to retrieve another bit of parchment and sighed. "I know. I just can't seem to help it. If I stop and allow myself to think all I do is worry, then I'm going to fail everything. That's my boggart, after all." Pansy smirked. "Your boggart is a parchment of old teas." Hermione snorted at that. "No, it's Professor McGonagall telling me I failed everything." Pansy shook her head, not holding back her laughter. "Priceless! You rode a dragon, and your greatest fear is failing school." Hermione flushed and then chuckled softly. "I was terrified of riding the dragon, too." Pansy was now shaking with laughter, but when Hermione stuck her tongue out at the witch, her eyes went calculating, and she stopped laughing to yell loudly, "Bob, your mistress hasn't eaten." Hermione looked at her horrified. "Pansy!" But it was too late. Bob was there with a stern expression, looking over at the tray of uneaten fruit and toast. "Bob will bring more food and tea, as mistress will take a break." With a snap of the little elf fingers, all of Hermione's notes disappeared, and the elf was gone. Hermione looked down in shock, and then back up at Pansy, whom she gave her best death glare. "Just you wait, Pansy Parkinson. I will get you back for that." Pansy shrugged and held up her left hand, where a beautiful and large round emerald sat nestled by the brightest diamonds and goblin silver. "As we are to be family, I say go ahead." Hermione tried to stay mad, but couldn't. Instead, she sighed over the beautiful ring her brother had gotten the witch. "It's such a lovely ring," Hermione said honestly. Pansy smiled fondly, looking down at it. "I know. He did really well." Hermione nodded, and having nothing else to do, she threw herself back on the bed and settled in for a visit with Pansy over tea and sandwiches, under the watchful eyes of a now upset Bob. The days and nights blended together, until finally the last exam had been taken, and Hermione found herself on Draco's lap, smiling as the bottle of 1,000-gallon mead was passed around the room. She had expected her anxiety to remain, but surprisingly, as soon as she had set down the quill after her potions exam, all she had felt was relief. Draco's arms tightened around her, and she snuggled into him, her hand linking with his. "Ready for graduation tomorrow?" he whispered in her ear. Hermione shivered and tilted her head more so that he could nibble on her earlobe. "What exactly is a graduation at Hogwarts?" she asked breathlessly. "I couldn't find anything on it in Hogwarts history, and we don't exactly graduate as Muggles. They just mail out our exam results." Draco snorted. "How anticlimactic." Hermione smiled into his neck, and a bit playfully. "So what happens tomorrow night?" Draco sighed and lifted her face so he could kiss her lips fully, and then smiled down at her. "Are you saying I know something the great Hermione Granger does not?" Hermione punched him in the ribs. "Stop teasing. It's like a secret ceremony no one will talk about, and I hate secrets." Draco laughed, stroking her hair off her face. "It's not that big of a deal. Someone at some point started calling it a graduation, which I think is a Yank saying. But really it's just a feast, and then we take the boats back across the lake at midnight as a symbolic goodbye to the school. It's only recently that most wizards and witches sit for their NEWTs." "Really? Are the results not sent out by Owl, then?" Draco rubbed her arms, his face calm and happy. "No, they still are, but there is a celebration for finishing NEWTs held. But again, don't ask me why we call it graduation." He tickled her. "Probably a Muggle started that." Hermione giggled at this and his tickling. "And it's just a feast and a boat ride." Draco nodded and shrugged back to holding her. "That's all I ever got out of my parents, at least. If anything else does happen, they didn't mention it." Hermione nodded and rested her head back on his chest, playing with the buttons of his shirt. "Do we take the train home once we get to Hogsmeade?" Draco laughed. "The train is there, but my father said usually the students head into the village to celebrate by getting pissed. I believe Blaise is throwing a bash at his home in Hogsmeade." Hermione knew her eyes had gone wide. "He owns a house in Hogsmeade?" Draco snorted. "Of course. You couldn't expect his mother to stay in a dingy inn when she visited her son at school." Hermione giggled at that, and then let out a long breath. "Can you believe it's all finished?" Draco was playing with her hair, but she felt him stiffen a bit. "Yeah, I won't miss the classes, but I will miss the castle." "Me too, although I will also miss the classes," Hermione said softly. Draco chuckled at that, and then took the bottle from a smiling Theo, and they had to tune back into the conversation around them. He didn't mind sharing her time for the moment. He had a surprise planned for her for later, an entire month with her all to himself to look forward to. That night they made slow, sweet love in a classroom that Draco had converted into a beautiful room that reminded her of how she pictured an Arabian harem might look. It was the first time in weeks that she felt she could take her time, but their desire was so acute that they both basically stripped the clothes off each other. However, when she finally got her hands on his naked body, her heart seemed to calm. It was almost like she was slow dancing in a fire. She burned with need, but she wanted to take it slow and savor it. Draco seemed to feel the same, because he too was taking his time, his lips moving slowly from one to the other, and his hands driving her to the point of no return over and over, before she finally shoved him onto his back and set the pace herself. She knew he didn't mind because his eyes burned up at her with the same lust she was wrestling with. But to punish him, he set a slow pace, making sure to keep the strokes long and steady, daring him to quicken the pace. Eventually, it would seem he had finally reached his breaking point, because the grip he had on her hips became a bit painful, and he flipped her so that she was under him, and he could set the pace. As it meant she had multiple orgasms, Hermione didn't mind at all, and when he finally lost total control, it was her name on his lips, and she got lost in the sensation of feeling him shudder in her arms. They lay there for a long time, coming down from that moment before Draco pulled the colorful and fluffy blanket over the top of them, and she drifted off to sleep in his arms. Hermione blinked open her eyes and giggled as she took in the very heavy rugs that had been used to make the fake desert tent, and shifted on the plush pillow that had been charmed into a bed. She rolled over and saw that Draco was still sleeping, his face peaceful. She ran her finger along his lips, and then laughed when he nipped at it. "Morning, sleepyhead," she said, leaning over to kiss him sweetly. He groaned and rolled her under him, the blankets shifting to show his morning hard-on. "Morning? What time is it?" Hermione rubbed his shoulders and shrugged, leaning up to kiss the side of his neck. "I have no idea. Some wild man carted me off to this room and didn't let me bring my wand." Draco snorted. "I did not stop you from bringing your wand. You were just too tired to remember to grab it. And you are very lucky I happen to still have mine and could cast our contraceptive charm." Hermione giggled at that, and then gasped as his lips left a burning trail down her neck. "Bob makes me take a potion every day." Draco grunted. "Given the magic binding us, I figure doubling up is probably smart." Hermione moaned and moved her head so that he could nibble at the spot just below her ear. "Would you mind if we got pregnant?" Draco paused in his nibbling and then shrugged. "I figure we are probably doomed in that regard. The magic will decide for us." Hermione sighed and kissed him before she felt her stomach grumble and grimaced. "I think you are right, and I am starving. Now that all that anxiety is over from exams, I think I have a few meals to make up for." Draco chuckled and rolled them so that she was laying on top of him. "Call Bop. You will probably leave her weeping into a tea towel by telling her you are hungry before she can show up to try and force you to eat." Hermione pinched him and kissed his chest. "I am not calling for Bop without knowing what time it is. What if she is sleeping? Besides, we are naked, and I have a strict rule about any elves seeing us with no clothes on." Draco laughed outright at this and shook his head, cuddling her closer to him, and reaching for his wand so that he could check the time. "Good news, love. It is well after the time the elves would be up, and we missed breakfast. So get some clothes on and call for food, so that we can eat and I can ravish you again before lunch." Hermione huffed but smiled and reached for a dressing gown someone had laid out for her. "Who set up the room?" Draco looked affronted. "I did. I just had Bop stock it with whatever you would need," he said, gesturing at her dressing gown. He was shrugging into a silk dressing gown himself. Hermione grinned and called for Bop, who was indeed beyond thrilled to serve her mistress breakfast, and shed a few tears at being asked to do so, making Hermione feel a bit guilty that she had given up her normal visiting hours with the elf for exams. When she told Bop this and promised to take up tea again with the little elf, Bop burst into sobs and left in a loud pop. Hermione looked over wide-eyed at Draco, who shrugged, handing her a sausage. "You get used to it. My nanny elf still sobs when I ask her to freshen my sheets," he said before he dug into his own full English breakfast with gusto. After lunch, Hermione was stolen by the girls, who were all getting ready together. Dress robes of all colors were hung up over the dormitory, and elves bustled around doing hair while a witch that Pansy had hired did all their makeup. Hermione was shocked to learn that what Draco had told her seemed pretty true. The mysterious graduation was assumed to be a feast and a boat ride at midnight. "You don't think there has to be something more?" Hermione asked Tracy, who was twirling in her gold dress robes. "No, I don't think so." The witch flushed and then said, "Harry is my date." Hermione gave the witch her undivided attention. "What? Really?" Tracy nodded, her face still pink. "My family put aside my other contract when I told them how much I really liked him. He sent a declaration of intent to my father 2 days ago, and it's been accepted." Hermione was flabbergasted. "I had no idea you two were dating." Tracy gave a nervous laugh. "Not dating, owling, but I like him rather a lot, and I wanted your blessing." Hermione's eyes went wide before she stood up, hugging the witch in excitement and happiness. "Oh, you have it! Now tell me exactly what this means." Eventually, the party of witches made their way to the main Slytherin common room, where a collection of wizards in dress robes waited for them. Hermione smiled as she saw Luna float happily over to a grinning Neville. There was a ring on her left finger now, too. Tracy blushed prettily as Harry kissed her hand, and Hermione had to giggle at how well he pulled off the gentleman act. Although he winked at her when he was done with the formalities, and she had laughed loudly enough to have most of the room looking at her. Draco, however, was missing, and she looked at her brother curiously. Theo smirked with his arm around Pansy, who was in a pale pink dress robes of the finest silk. He had to pick something up in Diagon Alley. Should be back in time. Pansy elbowed him hard. Should be? Don't worry your sister, you prat. She turned to Hermione with a wide smile. He will be here any moment. Before Hermione could say anything, the door to the common room opened, and Draco stepped in, taking her breath away. He was in dark blue dress robes that made his eyes look almost silver and his hair shine. He seemed to be just as stunned by her, because he stopped and stared at her for a moment before he chuckled. Pansy dress you? Hermione nodded, looking down and seeing the humor. She was in ice blue dress robes that complemented his perfectly. What did you need in Diagon Alley? She asked, rushing forward to hug him to her. It had been a few hours since she had seen him, and her rune had started to itch. Well, why don't you try and guess? Hermione looked up in surprise and then laughed at his teasing. Guess? I couldn't even imagine. Draco kissed her nose and then sunk to a knee, pulling out a velvet box. Can't you? Hermione went perfectly still as she watched the velvet box open to reveal a stunning blue stone, oval in setting and so simple that you almost missed the interlay of lattice on the delicate silver band. Draco! Draco watched his witch's face carefully as she studied the ring in the box. It had cost him a small fortune, but if the look of wonder and joy on her face was any indication, it was worth every galleon. It was a blue diamond of the highest quality that had been enchanted just for her. He had commissioned the ring earlier that year so that it would be ready for graduation. Hermione Jean Granger Knott, I love you. Would you do me the great honor of becoming my wife? Draco waited as her eyes shifted focus from the ring to him, and smiled softly as the tears he saw starting to drop. Say yes, love, and don't mess your makeup, or Pansy will have my head. This seemed to snap her out of her shock, because she threw back her head laughing, carefully wiped at the tears in her eyes, and nodded her head, throwing herself into his arms, not even mindful of the ring he had almost dropped. Yes, 1,000 times yes, you silly wizard! Draco lifted her up and put the ring on her finger, feeling the magic meld with hers, and heedless of the clapping all around him as he kissed her.